Under the Articles of Confederation, the government had lacked the resources to open up the Western territories. But this changed quickly under the new national government. Washington's administration sought first to militarily subdue the native tribes of the Ohio Valley, who were blocking American settlement of the region. In 1791, a federal army under General St. Clair marched into western Ohio, seeking to engage the allied tribes. The campaign soon turned into a disaster, as the American forces were ambushed, and almost 70% of the U.S. troops were killed. Undeterred, the federal government raised a larger army in 1794, headed this time by General Mad Anthony Wayne. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Wayne's army defeated the Allied tribes and forced them to sign the Treaty of Greenville. This agreement ceded most of the native claims to the Northwest Territory, in exchange for about $25,000 worth of trade goods, and a promise of further payments of $10,000 per year to the tribes. The new government also reached agreements with Spain and Britain, which helped ease tensions in the region. Jay's Treaty in 1794 ensured that Britain would finally remove their troops from the Northwest and stop encouraging native attacks upon American settlers. The following year, Pinckney's Treaty, 1795, established clear boundaries between Spanish and American lands and guaranteed the rights of Americans to travel on the Mississippi, the critical waterway connecting the Northwest to the Atlantic. Like Britain, Spain agreed to cease arming native tribes in the region. While U.S. policy in the Northwest was successful, other foreign conflicts proved more difficult. The U.S. had a number of unresolved issues with Britain stemming from the Revolution. Aside from the clash in the Northwest Territory, the U.S. government had requested that the British pay compensation for the slaves taken during the Revolution, and that they reopen British ports in the West Indies to American merchants. Efforts to resolve these disputes were complicated by the outbreak of war between Britain and Revolutionary France in 1793. Determined to use its powerful navy to throttle French trade, the British government authorized the seizure of American vessels trading with French possessions in the West Indies. As war strained the resources of the British Navy, they also began to supplement the crews of their ships by boarding U.S. vessels and impressing their sailors into military service. In 1794, the Washington administration sent John Jay to Great Britain to try and resolve these issues. The treaty would prove to be controversial. Jay did obtain some concessions, such as agreement over the status of the Northwest Territories and promises to pay compensation for the seizure of American ships. However, the treaty failed to restore trade with the British West Indies, and it tacitly accepted British restrictions upon trade with the French West Indies, failures which infuriated many Americans. The U.S. also soon faced significant conflicts with France. In 1789, the French had emulated the American example and thrown off their king. The U.S. immediately recognized the new regime, delighted with the birth of a fellow republic. This enthusiasm cooled as the revolution became more radical, and France witnessed mass executions of people deemed hostile to the new government. While some, such as Thomas Jefferson, saw this violence as the necessary cost of establishing a new society, others, like Hamilton and Washington, were horrified by what they saw as the ugly excesses of mob rule run rampant. This quickly became a key issue separating the emerging political factions in the American government. French diplomacy also alienated many Americans. The first representative France sent to the United States was Edmond Charles Genet, who, adopting the radical egalitarianism of the French Revolution, referred to himself simply as Citizen Genet. Recognizing that President Washington was less than enthusiastic about the revolution, Genet largely ignored the American government and went directly to the people to rally support for the French war against Britain. Taking matters a step further, he began to commission privateers in American ports to harass British shipping, a significant violation of American neutrality, which led the U.S. to petition France to have him removed from his diplomatic post. Jay's treaty with Britain complicated matters even more. The French government was already upset the United States was refusing to honor the 1778 Treaty of Alliance, under which the United States was obliged to help protect their possessions in the West Indies. Jay's treaty infuriated them even further, since it accepted British restrictions on American trade with France. In response, French warships began to harass and seize American merchant vessels. An American delegation sent to resolve this crisis was received with high-handed arrogance. Asking to see the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, the delegation was informed that they would only be heard if they first paid an enormous bribe and offered France a loan to help finance their war with Britain. This became known as the XYZ affair, since in the report that was ultimately released to the public, Talleyrand's representatives, who communicated this insulting message, were referred to simply as X, Y, and Z. With negotiations at a standstill, the country teetered on the brink of an all-out war with France. Indeed, between 1798 and 1800, American and French naval vessels did clash in what became known as the Quasi-War. Faced with this looming conflict, the government began a military buildup. With the example of Citizen Genet still fresh in their minds, many people in the government were also deeply concerned about the potential for internal subversion. During this era, the United States was becoming increasingly politically fragmented between two factions: the Federalists, who generally favored the British, and the Democratic Republicans, who were more sympathetic to Republican France. It was this latter group that Citizen Genet had appealed to for support, and it was this group which had raised the loudest protests at Jay's Treaty, which clearly favored Britain over France. In response to these fears, Congress passed what became known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. These measures were designed to limit the rights of immigrants who were seen as potentially radical and pro-French elements. The Sedition Act was even more sweeping. It declared it illegal to utter or publish, quote, any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States, or either House of the Congress of the United States, or the President of the United States, with intent to defame the said government, unquote. This measure was clearly designed to silence the Democratic Republican groups, which had criticized the government's policies favoring the British. Federalists like Alexander Hamilton argued that these criticisms were not legitimate political dissent, but rather treason. Many Americans, however, saw these measures as heavy-handed infringements of free speech, and in 1798, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison respectively penned the Virginia and Kentucky Resolves, which condemned the acts and asserted that the states could declare them unconstitutional, an early expression of what became known as compact theory, the idea that the ultimate right to decide if a federal law was constitutional remained with the states.